and you're recording.
Hello and welcome to African Americans in the 2024 elections, presented by the Race, Politics, and Policy Center in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I am Michael Fauntroy, Director of the Center. The just concluded presidential election was a closely contested match that put a spotlight on America's party coalitions. Gender, race, region, religion, and education were among the usual fault lines that shaped the outcome. And today we want to dig into this a bit with an emphasis on Black voters. And we will, of course, situate this in the larger context of the overall election results. Dr. Fredrick C. Harris is here to help us sort it out. He is a class of 1933 professor of political science and the former dean of the faculty in the social sciences at Columbia University, where he currently directs the Center on African American Politics and Society. Professor Harris's research interests are primarily in American politics with a focus on race and politics, political participation, social movements, religion and politics, political development, and African American politics. He is an award-winning author of several books and articles. In his book, The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics, received the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for nonfiction. His current research explores the history of Black public intellectuals and will be published by Oxford University Press under the title Critical Thinkers, a history of the public ideas of Black intellectuals and activists. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and has served in a variety of other capacities at institutions around the country and, in fact, around the world. So, Professor Harris, thank you for joining us today. I want everyone to know before we get started that those of you who are watching are free to submit questions in the Q&A. We will get to those at the appropriate time. And so with that, let's get started. Dr. Harris, I am tempted to begin with a very simple question, and that is what happened, right? But that's a little too broad for our purposes today. So I want to start not as broadly, and that is to get to some general observations from you around the election.
Okay.
And I'm particularly interested in what, if anything, surprised you in the results.
Right. Well, those are big questions, even the condensed ones. But before I get started, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a wonderful opportunity to get to chat with you, Professor Fauntroy. There are some continuities that I think are important to note, and there are some changes ahead that I think we should observe. The continuities is that African Americans, no matter what people were concerned about in terms of whether they become more Republican in their voter choice, whether they're going to lean toward independence, are pretty much as I'm thinking of the title of a recent book, are steadfast Democrats. And so what we saw is that 85% of African Americans who showed up at the poll, and that's a very important distinction, voted for Harris. Only 13% voted for Trump. And so if you look in the exit polls from 2020, they're not that much different. From a CNN exit poll from that year of 2020, 87% voted for Biden and 12% for Trump. So there was a lot of concern, a lot of huffing and puffing about, whether there's going to be a significant amount of Black voters, particularly Black men, and I'm sure we'll get to that subset of voters in a moment. We're going to be enough to upset a Democratic candidate in a very closely contested race that turned out to be not as close as people thought. So so that's the continuity, right? So what are the possible changes? I think one of the possible changes that have been thrown out is this broad coalition that, in my view, came at its height, at least into the electoral aspects of that coalition in 2008 and 2012 with the election and re-election of Barack Obama, building a very much a broad multiracial coalition. And so this strategy actually, Professor Fontroy, sure you know people who were personally involved during this era, it evolved during the mid 1960s, right? With the strategist Bayard Rustin making the argument that the coalition that evolved right after the 1963 March on Washington should be redirected toward electoral politics and support for the Democratic Party. A coalition of African Americans, the dispossessed, as Shirley Chisholm and Jesse Jackson would say later on, labor unions, and also particularly those who had religious liberal leanings. And so the question is that where is that coalition today? And so with this past election, it does raise questions about what that future will be, particularly when we look at Latino voters, particularly Latino men, who really had a hard, visible shift from voting for the Democratic standard bearer to the Republican standard bearer.
So let me pick up on that last point. There are a variety of different exit polls out there. The AP Votecast, CNN, NBC News, among others that I've seen, suggested about 48% of Latino men voted for Trump, which is a substantial number, particularly when you compare it to 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a substantial number, back to one of your earlier points, compared with Black men. One of the narratives that was developing in the run-up to the election was, it appears that Black men are about to go with Trump, and what does that mean in terms of gender cleavages within the Democratic Party or among Black people? But as you rightly pointed out, in the end, these numbers are within historical norms.
Right.
So I'm less surprised by that. But there is one sort of subset of that Black male vote that I want to get your take on, and that is those younger voters, 18 to 30, for example,
Right.
in which about 30% of those voters voted for Trump. And what might that mean for the Democratic Party going forward?
Right. Well, there are theories about sort of generational shifts. One is that, that there is a life cycle effect to all of this, that, actually if you go back even to the Reagan years, to be truthful, if you sort of divvy out age and race, or looking at African American men or young people in particular, they seem to have more softer commitments to the Democratic Party historically. But as they get older, they began to vote more in line with their parents and their grandparents. So there's sort of a life cycle, less attachments. But I think there's something perhaps different that is occurring now, and as we go ahead, is that the political institutions or the agents of socialization, Black churches, community organizations, all those sorts of things have been on the wane in the past years. Even sort of the schooling that ones get the education that one gets in their early ages has a very important socializing effect, particularly if it's within communities that vote Republican or Democrat or whatever. I think those institutions have weakened over time. And so I think, particularly for young people, social media is a very important source of receiving political information. And so since you don't have those agents of socialization that were as strong as they used to be, or to sort of put it within another context, sort of the theory of linked fate that our colleague Michael Dawson at University of Chicago theorized about, sort of the solidarity of of Black voter preferences for the Democratic Party, where the sort of the individual links their preferences for a policy or candidate based on evaluating what's going on with Blacks as a group. In some sectors, maybe the individual preferences are far more stronger or greater than they used to be, as opposed to how they feel that their fate is linked with the destiny of the group. And I think part of that may be the weakening of social institutions, organizations that are social agents of socialization. So that may be one thing, but also, as I said before, it may be also the case that this is, as time goes on, this group of voters will become far more democratic than that we've seen in this past election. But the other thing that's related to this is that, and this is related to the previous questions around coalitions, is that African Americans are a captured constituency within the Democratic Party, right? Based on their preferences, based on their interests. The Republican Party is seen to be hostile to the collective interest of African Americans. And so what's interesting to me is not only who showed up at this election, but who didn't show up. Because the choice often for African American voters, and I think this is where analysts sort of are confused by or don't get the story straight, it's not sort of whether African Americans are going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican, at least on the national ticket. It's the question of whether they're going to vote Democrat or show up at all. Those are the choices that African American voters have deployed over several decades. So it'll be interesting to see how things manifest in the years to come.
So let me add an additional theory or two around what you were saying and get your evaluation of it. So younger voters, generally speaking, are the least experienced and the least reliable in terms of turnout. And so one theory I've heard is that many of these younger voters just sort of inexperienced and didn't know what they were doing, for lack of a better phrase. And that's a condescending perspective at some level. Whatever, regardless of whatever truth may be there. But it ties to something I'm deeply concerned about, and that is just generally civic education.
Yes.
I am deeply worried that the failure to effectively teach civics in schools across the country without regard to race and class and all of those other important SES factors has created a scenario in which lies, when told frequently enough, are unchallenged or certainly not thought about critically. And I'm just interested in knowing from you or getting your assessment on this notion of sort of poor civic education, misinformation, and inexperienced sort of, for lack of a better phrase, life experience in terms of the voting decision. And how much of that do you think we need to be thinking about as well as we evaluate what happened 2 weeks ago?
Right. I think that's a very interesting question. I think there has been changes over the years, over the decades around civic education. I even wonder, I was thinking about this question in another context. I have a high schooler and I haven't seen much sort of, I've seen courses on, US history and they would spend time on the presidency and Congress, but no deep kind of understanding about civic institutions, how they work. Or even sort of running, students running for student government, which was a habit forming activity that was very important, that sort of was the breeding ground in some ways of, future leaders, even future politicians seem to have diminished. And so, but On the other hand, there, what this, to look at it from a generational perspective, generation has also been involved in social movements, right? Around Black Lives Matter in particular for the last 10 years, and many of them have been engaged in that kind of activity. Now, there are some also questions about sort of, how their modes or engagement or organizing is quite different from Black communities or Black social movements in the past. But nonetheless, I think many young people do have an understanding of politics. I think just generally, there is a lack of understanding, and that comes from the top down, from the political institutions, how they operate in Congress and on the executive side as well, as is how to compromise and how to settle grievances, which is a whole other thing that's linked to sort of these habits of civic engagement. I mean, Robert Putnam, the political scientist who wrote Bold and Alone, sort of warned us of this 20 or 30 years ago, the decline of people involved in civic organizations of all types, religious institutions, and how that was strongly correlated or related to this trust in political institutions and others. So I think these things are mutually reinforcing. I think it's a lot of things that's going on. And I think that the lack of civic engagement and teaching about it in schools is just a part of a larger issue around what's happening with civic decay and discourse in the US.
So I am fighting the urge to view this from a sort of cynical perspective,
Mm-hmm.
because a cynic might say, well, the politicians prefer a less civically engaged and educated electorate because it makes it easier for them to say and do some of the things that they want to say and do. And it's been difficult for me to sort of resist that
Mm-hmm.
urge. Now, you and I come from a generation in which we've seen statesmen and women, and over the years, and then look at our current leadership class, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and aren't jumping out on a limb by saying some of these current folks couldn't be in the same room with some of these leaders,
Right.
a generation or two ago.
Right.
And yet here we are with this. And so when we dive into some of these narratives about Black voters or Latino voters or some of that, I just worry that that the lack of civic engagement and civic education
Mm-hmm.
is sort of a tinderbox that allows for a lot more dysfunction to foment, and when the appropriate time presents itself, it just explodes. So that's a trouble for me.
I know, but you also, Professor Fontroy, you have to keep in mind that there's some civic engagements that are going on. They may not be necessarily on the side that we may have a personal
Mhm.
political commitment to. I mean, I'm always astounded and in some ways impressed, for instance, by the political right, the Republican Party, who show up at school board meetings, who challenge people on the so-called critical race theory,
Mhm.
history that people are, quote, students are forced to learn. That took a great deal of grassroots organizing, coordination, strategy. And the question for me, particularly on the other side, the left, the progressive, the Democratic Party side, is that whether sort of there's a more of a top-down organizing than it is a bottom-up organizing. Where has that, meant, where were the voices on the other side that would promote the learning of slavery and history in public schools? Did they
Mhm.
show up in the same way? Right? What were the organizational bases around that? Did they rely too much on public officials? Did public officials need the backup they need from grassroots activism? Where are the traditional civil rights organizations,
Mhm.
right? Do they have a mass constituency, and could they sort of turn out people to vote or to show up on issue-oriented, policy-oriented issues at those places like school boards. So to me, and this goes back, let's shift back a little bit to sort of Black voters and Black politics. Black politics become more elite driven rather than grassroots driven? I mentioned Bayard Rustin and sort of this idea from protest to politics coming out of a mass movement. Shirley Chisholm, when she ran in 72, didn't get the support she did, but she went to the grassroots. We know, because we were younger people in the 80s, that Jesse Jackson's campaign in 84 and 88 was a grassroots effort that even challenged Democratic Black elites in the party. And they got behind him ultimately. Where is that grassroots energy within Black politics, within Black institutions, and why aren't we seeing the same level of engagement as we see on the right?
So that actually is a question for a whole other webinar, because the grassroots organizing on the right has been significant, consistent, and successful
Mhm.
going back to Reagan,
Mhm.
and perhaps a little before, because it helped to get Reagan across the finish line.
Mhm.
And so, and as it relates to what's going on the left, I think part of the issue is the left is being reactive to what's being done on the right, where the right is constantly pushing the
Right.
agenda. So ban books, okay, now we got to organize to stop the bans. But by the
Mhm.
time you organize to stop the bans,
They
you
want
got
to
a 1,000 books that have been removed from state libraries. So that's part of the concern around organizing from my
Mhm.
perspective. You mentioned Jesse Jackson. I'm so glad you did, because as the years go on,
Mhm.
it's been 40 years since he first ran for president, and I think the 84 campaign, even more so than the 88 campaign,
Mhm.
was, Bernie Sanders was an early supporter and organizer
Mhm.
for Jesse Jackson in 1984, right? And the remnants of that generation is beginning to age out of American politics, replaced by a more, to your point, I think that's right, maybe more elite driven, which
Professionalized.
professionalized, absolutely. Uh,
Mhm.
and that helps to explain some of the recoiling that I think you saw among non-college educated voters toward the Democrats in
Mhm.
this election.
Mhm.
62%, I believe, of non-college educated white women voted for Donald Trump,
Right.
which, again, is roughly about where it was in 2020. But when you look at what has transpired from 2020 to 2024, that number seems a bit of a surprise to me. And so I'd be curious and dig into that a little more and find out why that was the case. But I'm mentioning Jesse Jackson in this context because, there were a lot of people that poo-pooed the notion of a rainbow coalition
Right.
in 1984 and,
Right.
and continuing that in 1988. But that rainbow coalition that he helped start in 1984 and 1988
Mhm.
helped lay the groundwork with, Howard Dean's 50-state strategy when he became the DNC chair,
Mhm.
for Barack Obama to win in 2008. So when you talk about what
Mhm.
happened with that coalition, that Obama coalition, I
Mhm.
think there's some substantial soul searching that's going to have to be done among Democrats if the goal is to sort of win elections. It's one thing to
Mhm.
say, well, we lost the electoral college, but we won the popular vote. That didn't happen this go round. You lost both, right? And so there's, while there are um,
Mhm.
some rays of sunshine in the overall electorate. Look at what happened in North Carolina and some other states in
Mhm.
which Democrats did better. That sort of fundamental coalition question, I think, has to be addressed too. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Jesse Jackson on that, because,
Um,
you know, he's a lion in winter now. And I know he's, for people of a certain age, he's somewhat of a controversial figure. But if you look at what his 84 and 88 campaigns did,
Right.
it really did bring new voters in, which
Mhm.
helped to lead to Doug Wilder getting elected as governor in Virginia, and David Dinkins in New York,
New
and
York,
Wellington Webb in Denver, Norm
mhm,
Rice in Seattle,
Seattle. Hmm.
Mike White in Cleveland. I mean, these candidates did their work, there's no question about it, but part of the foundation that allowed for them to be successful is rooted in that 84 campaign.
Right. But not only that, I mean, in many ways, he set up the possibility that a candidate like Barack Obama could win in 2008 because of the sort of arcane rule changes around winner take all um, delegates collection. And so because of those rule changes that made it far more proportional in the allocation of delegates, rather than if a candidate goes in and wins 51% of the vote or plurality of the vote, they get all the delegates in some of those states. That really did help Barack Obama in a closely contested primary contest in 2008.
Mhm.
That was because of what Jesse Jackson pushed for back in 1988. But I do think that sort of as we political scientists have been studying for decades, the political incorporation of African Americans within the Democratic Party. The question is that what has that meant, and how has that changed the dynamics of Black politics as we think of different ways and strategies. It was, Shirley Chisholm and Jackson, particularly Jackson in 84, not in 88, wanted to use running for president as a leverage to get issues that are important to African Americans on the Democratic Party agenda, right? And so we come today, well, what is the agenda for? Is representation itself enough? Does representation means that necessarily that the candidates of color or the standard bearer of the Democratic Party are going to necessarily, right,
Right.
support the interests? And then there's a broader question, which is, as you said for a moment, couldn't be possibly answered in this webinar, is that what are the interests of African Americans
Mhm.
as we are a quarter in about within the 21st century? Are they the same? Are there things that consistently that African Americans should support, like civil rights, around employment, criminal justice? But besides that, what are they, particularly as you see greater class differentiation within, social class differentiation within the Black community?
So I love that word representation because, as you know, it can mean a number of different things.
Hmm.
There's a sort of descriptive representation or the substantive representation. And here is a sort of source of conflict, I think, in
Hmm.
Black politics generally.
Hmm.
Um, Trying to figure out how to say this without getting in trouble. Uh,
This is what I like to do, Professor Functroy. I got you in the cut like I
uh,
actually do my
that's
students
okay.
in seminar.
I do the same thing. It's just, role reversal, right? So I make this point with regard to a Congressional Black Caucus.
Hmm.
Never before has there been as many members
Oh
in the
no.
CBC as we have right now.
60 plus. Could you imagine that in the early 70s when
No
they were
way.
starting out, when they walked out on Richard Nixon
Yeah,
because, doing the State of the Union address because he wasn't, he refused to meet with them.
right. No, yeah, no question. It's a
Right.
stunning number,
Hmm.
but it's also fair to say, well, what has that gotten us? Now, I understand, and as you do,
Hmm.
that there's this is part of a much broader ecosystem, and it's at some level unfair
Hmm.
to, to, to even raise that question, understanding that there's a whole lot that goes into the making and unmaking of public policy.
Right.
Um, but I also remember a time when the Congressional Black Caucus on an annual basis did a constructive alternative budget,
Right.
which laid out priorities,
Hmm.
right? Laid out an agenda.
Right.
We haven't had that since Barack Obama was elected president. And so, to your question about what's the agenda, I think because there's so many people talking about agendas that there's a lot of conflict about what the priorities should be or could be. And
Right.
and I think in some ways it's probably more difficult to put together a cohesive agenda that sort of speaks to a broad range of interests because I think there's so much disagreement about what some of the interests are. And by the way, we haven't even taken into consideration yet the impact of, you mentioned social media. I would narrow that even more to the whole podcast universe,
Hmm.
where everybody now can literally start their own podcast, say
Hmm.
whatever they want to say, and in many cases, it's going to go unchecked, which also impacts the public discourse depending on the size and shape and form of your audience.
Right. But I don't want to sound too much like a fuddy-duddy, like in our day, this happened. But I do remember a day when I would open the Washington Post, but also the Baltimore African American, and I would look at the op-ed pages, particularly in Black newspapers, and then on the left I would read Manning Marable, and on the right I would read Soul, or I forget the economist who was at George
Walter
Mason.
Williams.
Walter Williams had a
Yes,
column in Black newspapers,
right,
right? And you would get, this is where you would get your information. You know, one would say, oh, I don't agree with this sort of conservative Republican slant, but the economist Walter Williams makes a good point on this,
right.
right?
Hmm.
Today, people are going in their different corners. As I tell my students, when I was growing up in my early days, there were three basically networks. They all said the same things. Some of them had commentary. Everybody tried to, the New York Times and the Washington Post usually set the agenda for the news. Um, but today, people are getting their source of getting their information, their political information from different sources.
Hmm.
And they're not, quote, mainstream sources or sources that have been vetted. People sort of are going into their particular corners. And this is also what I find fascinating about this election is the rise of celebrities and social media influencers, right? Which accounts for a part of this noise that people, particularly around Black men, just
Hmm.
because there were all these influencers who were talking about, Harris and the Democratic Party, and giving a critique from a conservative perspective, and they have lots of views and lots of clicks, people thought that that was enough to influence Black male voters, which is absolutely amazing to me. But
Hmm.
it points to the fact that we're in a new territory where we don't know, where all these sources of information, that there's no, for many people, no credible that no sort of credible space where there's a shared understanding that if you get the information from this source, it must be truth, right, or facts. Right. And so I think this for our democracy more generally, and particularly as we think ahead about African American politics and what's maybe the residuals, I'll put it that way, of the Obama coalition, how our sort of Democratic Party and others who are concerned about Black voters and their interests are going to go ahead where we have sort of this splintering or fragmentation in the way that we understand truth and facts.
So let me flip that coin and
Hmm.
talk about it from get your take on this from the perspective of the Republican Party.
Hmm.
Because, and this is not new for those of us who follow this,
Hmm.
we know that it seems like every 4 years for a while now, the Republican Party has said it's going to do more to get Black voters. And then the number ends up being about where it's always been.
Hmm.
And so uh, a modest increase, which is what we saw in 2024, is better than no increase, of course. So, what do you think the Republicans can or should do if they are serious about winning over larger shares of Black voters? And let me just preface this by saying, I've always taken the position that a lot of that talk is for the consumption of white suburban voters
Oh yeah, we're
around
concerned about.
Philly, St. Louis,
Mhm.
Detroit, and places like that, not necessarily a
Right,
serious attempt at Black voters.
right. I don't know. I just think the question is from the position of the interests and concerns around inequality, justice, social justice issues, criminal justice issues that are mainstays among Black voters in terms of their issue preferences is so far away from the Republican Party. The question, is it even possible? But there is some areas where they could really begin to, I think, crack into Democratic Party support. And I think we see part of this, what's happening among Latino what I'm about to say. I have to go back because, you know, we're older. So we remember people by the name of Jack Kemp.
Yes.
From Buffalo, Republican congressman who really tried to sincerely bring more Blacks within the Democratic Party. But one of the things that
You mean Republican Party?
I mean Republican Party,
yeah.
thank you, Republican Party. But one of the things he emphasized is sort of Black enterprise, Black entrepreneurship. And so given sort of the huge interest among African Americans, how could there be, so the Republican Party could really sort of target policies or promote policies or explain to Black voters who are interested in entrepreneurship how they could benefit from Republican policies, and what the Republican Party could do to sort of support those efforts. It does not help, for instance, when right-wing groups, for instance, go after sort of what is this, there was this money put together by private entities to support Black women entrepreneurs that was challenged legally. That's not going to help.
Successfully challenged. Successfully challenged, yeah.
Right. That's not going to help.
Right.
And so, you know, my imagination runs very big here. Oh, if the president-elect had said, well, wait a minute, I understand that this may raise some concerns about discrimination, but we want people, who haven't had an opportunity to build businesses. This helps the economy. This allows people to be economically efficient and independent. I myself am an entrepreneur. But that's not sort of, it's the attack on all fronts when it comes to diversity and equity.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that when it comes to sort of policies that's independent of government, this is the thing, that program was independent of government funds. You would think that will be an area where the Republicans would champion.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Jack Kemp, who in many ways was an anomaly in the party because he played in the NFL for so many years. He had a socialization with Black people that's very different than the vast majority of white people in the United States. So he understood it in a much more visceral way than I think other politicians would or could. And as you were laying out this Black entrepreneurship thing, I thought about Richard Nixon, who in 1968 and 1972 was talking about Black capitalism.
Black capitalism.
And that was a way for him to sort of soften some of the edges around his law and order, which was overt, which was just sort of obviously racist, but could peel off, or at least appear to be sincere in trying to peel off some number of Black voters. So I just find that also pretty curious. So it's now, we had about 15 or so minutes left. If you don't mind, I want to shift to some questions. I want to encourage everybody who hasn't yet done so. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will take them as appropriate. I have a question here that I want to raise with you from David Armour, who asks, some of the earlier polls seem to show more Black support for Trump than in previous elections, but as you point out, the Black vote for Trump was not that different than in 2020. In contrast, the Hispanic vote for Trump was much higher, was higher and much higher for Hispanic men. What are the implications does this have for Black interests? What do you think about that?
I mean, again, it's difficult to define Black interest, but the question of what I thought was going to be asked, given the lead up to the question, is why the polls were so off,
Mhm.
right? The pre-election polls, and I think one of the things that pollsters don't often get right or can't quite figure out is that when they survey people or groups, or they really don't know what the level of the turnout will be. Right. And so you get some indication of the sentiment. They were right, for instance, in Michigan, right? It was a very
Mhm.
closely contested race. Off a bit in Pennsylvania. Um, but here again, you don't know what the turnout level will be among registered Republicans or registered Democrats. You may get an indication of how independents are going, but you don't even know what their turnout is going to be.
Mhm.
So that's just that.
Mhm.
The question, particularly about Black voters and Latino voters, is, again, sort of raises questions about coalition building and what that coalition will look like. There's some talks about that the right or the Republican Party is building a much broader coalition of working class people that include Latinos as a part, many Latinos as a part of that coalition. And the question is, what is going to mean for the future of the Democratic Party and how African Americans who are a captured constituency within the Democratic Party, who feel that they can go nowhere else, how are those interests, whatever they might be, broadly defined? Because I don't think those interests were clearly articulated in this election. In fact, I don't think they haven't really, they were kind of in 2016 because criminal justice reform, 2020 a little bit because it was post around the time of George Floyd. And by the way, given all sort of the largest protests that occurred across the United States since and exceeded what happened in 1967 and 68, particularly after the assassination of Dr. King, led to no major legislation around criminal justice reform. In fact, criminal justice reform wasn't even an issue in this presidential campaign.
Mhm. So let me just stand with you on that with this point. Not only was it not a part of this campaign, the Republican Party was not held accountable for the failure during the Trump administration of trying to get some criminal justice reform legislation
Right.
across the finish line.
Yeah.
You will recall there was a
Hmm.
whole lot of talk about Senator Tim Scott and
Right.
him working to get some criminal justice legislation across the finish line, and it never went anywhere.
Mm-mm.
And I think you can make the case that it was never going to go anywhere, but it certainly never went anywhere. And all of a sudden, the issue just sort of fell off the table as something that people need to be talking about.
Yeah, I had a tiny bit of hope only because Senator Scott gave a very passionate speech in the well of the U.S. Senate about how he had encounters with police, even in the in at the Capitol, where he said he was frequently stopped uh,
Mhm.
for people, as former Black people, I mean, as Black people in the past in Congress, I'm thinking of, oh my God, I forget her name. She was from Georgia, lost her seat. Cynthia McKinney,
Right. I
right?
remember.
Who also had sort of very challenging moments in dealing with the Capitol Hill police. So since he was sort of kind of divulging all of this, and we were at this critical moment, I think, well, that might be a chance. But it turned out that there was not, and perhaps on, but also I have to say on the Democratic Party side, unlike if we take an issue, for instance, like student loans and how the Biden administration tried all types of strategies, executive actions, going to court, trying to get something through Congress. That level of intensity engagement did not happen when it came to criminal justice reform.
Mhm.
I can't think of any major executive actions around the issue of criminal justice reform.
Yeah. So as we look from today going forward, what is what do you think both parties need to be considering as they look to rebuild or build or extend their coalitions for 26 and 28. And by the way, I just want to point out that 26, the Senate map for 26 is going to be as difficult for Republicans in some ways as the 24
Oh,
map
really?
was
Okay.
for
They have more
Democrats.
coming up.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
you know, if it turns out that one or both houses changes hands in 26, an already lame duck president, and by the way, he's starting off as a lame duck, would get even lamer if they were to lose one or both houses in 26. So
Right.
what's your, as you look into, as you look into your crystal ball and think about the out years, what are you seeing?
I think the Democratic Party, which is already happening, I'm sure as we speak here, is going through a reckoning, and they're going to have to sort of recharge. They're going to think, I suspect they're going to think more about um, what can they do to sort of recapture the working class. And again, the working class does not only include white people, which I think what they really mean sometimes when they say that, it's also people of color,
Mhm.
Latinos, particularly African Americans, most of whom are working to middle class, right? Um, and so I think that there's going to be a lean more to sort of bread and butter issues. We had historic inflation during this administration, and there was like nothing really said other than I support price controls.
Right.
How are you going to do that? What does it look like? What is your agenda going to be as an oppositional party? Again, I have to give a tip of the hat to the Republican Party because whether they're on defense or offense, they are ready. There is no big tent among them. You either get on board or you get pushed out.
Mhm.
And some of that has led to sort of chaos. We see that, when there was the election of the Speaker of the House. But in many ways, there have been many legislative victories. So with unified government for the first 2 years, and for a party that's very strategic, there's a plan already there. We know what their plan is, right? They're going to be running, and they know that what the vulnerabilities are will be 2 years later. And the question is that how much is going to be packed in before that election? I suspect, as always happens, right? We're political scientists. The party that's in power in the White House are going to lose seats in the midterm, and it's probably going to go over to the the Democrats. But they're going to have a plan and a message for the American people around these basic issues. And so I don't know. I have to say. It's going to be a long 4 years, particularly for Democratic voters and for African Americans who care about issues around economic issues, around criminal justice, just housing. That's another issue that's affecting working people, disproportionately African Americans. The Democratic Party really didn't address those issues, and the
Mhm.
upcoming administration will not either, likely.
So we got one last question, but I need to pick up on that last point because I think that is so critical. Nobody has created sort of boogeymen around certain issues that they know there are no easy fixes for. So let's,
Right,
whether it's inflation or sort of economic stuff, we know that
mhm,
economies run in cycles
right,
and that presidents in some cases get too much credit for when things go well and too much blame for when things go poorly. And the big example I'm going to be interested in watching over the next few years is going to be about so-called mass deportation.
right, immigration,
Right?
right,
How are you going to do that? How are you going to guarantee that everybody you're deporting is it should be deported,
right,
is in the country illegally? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? Is there such a thing as due process?
mhm,
All of this kind of stuff. But
yeah,
but but because we as a sort of electorate aren't thinking sort of beyond the headline, beyond the stump speech, I think that there are a lot of things that have been promised that may not be doable, or if they are doable, are going to be super expensive and take a lot longer than people probably have patience for.
Right. But Professor Funchal, before you go to the question, I do want to, because I was kind of jolted by the fact that, when you said people, I guess parties or politicians, particularly on the Democratic Party side, at least this is where I'm hearing, don't want to deal with difficult questions around housing and issues around sort of inflation and whatnot. When was that ever historically a problem for the Democratic Party, who knew its values, who had policymakers, think tanks in Washington, who cranked out these big ideas
Mhm.
that were going around trade, another issue, right?
Right.
Why don't they have these ideas? Or maybe they do, or why are they fearful of even promoting the ideas that they do?
I I think part of it is a communications problem. I
Hmm.
think some of these ideas exist, but there's such a competition. Our news diet, our collective news diet, is um, sort of far more complicated
Hmm.
by so many things that weren't a problem a generation ago. I think it's just a lot harder to break through, which means when somebody like President-elect Trump comes
Right,
with just the red meat,
right.
you don't need details. I'm just going to give you the red meat. Then it then then you can make some headway. But that's again communications, not policy,
Hmm.
and that gets back to an earlier point I was making. I'm not, again trying to fight cynicism. I'm not sure voters want ideas, right? And so that's
So we're
they
now with celebrity and influencers and people that you like, and since you like them, you trust them because they speak like you and they identify with
yeah,
you. It's sort of what political scientists documented decades ago about the candidate-centered
right,
elections rather than
yeah.
party-centered elections.
I think that's the case, and I'm thinking about Richard Hofstadter's anti-intellectualism in
Right.
American life. I think
Right.
there's a lot of that. We talked
Mm-hmm.
earlier about some of the sort of elitism that
Mm-hmm.
seems to be driving Democratic Party politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is a gumbo, right? As we get
Right.
close to Thanksgiving, right? This is a gumbo with a lot of different ingredients. One last question, we'll get you out of here. This is from
Okay.
Shannon Williams. There was a lot of talk in this election and in recent years about Democrats losing ground with unions. I'm curious about the relationship between Black voters and unions in future elections. Are unions courting Black workers or leaving them behind? And do you think shifts in the leanings and the eroding power of unions might affect the Black vote going forward?
Yeah, I think it already the sort of the weakening of unions in the U.S. African Americans in many of those battleground states that we identified this election cycle, places like Michigan and Wisconsin, and then those that are lean blue like Illinois have historically been strong union states. And African Americans in Ohio, which is a red state now. But the demise and the decline of labor unions more generally, with jobs, those industrial jobs, factory jobs going abroad, there are just fewer Americans who are part of labor unions.
Mhm.
And so part of the strategy, I think, outside of the Democratic Party, but that should be nurtured by the Democratic Party, as it was to give some a positive nod in this degree to President Biden, who did a great deal for labor unions, than has been acknowledged. I think there needs to be an effort to sort of build those union bases. I mean, at one point, I'm not sure if it is now, there were physicians talking about forming unions,
Mhm.
professional groups, service groups that we never thought before. Um, Graduate students, that some of the most contentious labor activities that have occurred in the past 2 years have been around graduate students at my
Mhm.
institution.
At
One
the
of
forefront of
here
that,
at
yeah,
Columbia. Hmm?
yeah, at the forefront of that
At the
fight.
forefront,
Mhm.
as it is on the forefront of a lot of social
Right.
movements. But um, And so I think, for, highly skilled, educated workers, there may be an uphill attention to this. But then again, there becomes this interesting bifurcation between the highly educated and those who are working class, who we seen traditionally as those who are more likely aligned around
Mhm,
unions. And so I don't know how that's going to be parsed out over time. Hopefully, there may be union building across different sectors in the economy, and that could help the Democratic Party. But I think that, and I just the way the economy is going, particularly around what's described as neoliberalism, and it's sort of linked to people, the idea that you yourself can be a business, you can start a business, and this is your lead to freedom.
mhm,
It's something that's called on. It's a part of the American spirit. It's, you see it among African Americans. No doubt you see this among particularly Latino men, who are, many of them themselves, within sectors
mhm.
that's engaged in entrepreneurship. So I just think the future is not quite clear at how all this is going to shake out. But go ahead,
I,
Professor.
I was just going to say, to your point, we are clearly in the midst of a reordering
Hmm.
of American coalition politics, right? And what we don't yet know is to what extent are the cleavages going to be around gender or education, educational attainment, or economic issues, and so forth. And I, whatever the analysis is done around 2024, and it comes to the state of Michigan, I think we also have to acknowledge that Michigan, in some respects, given the high percentage of Arab American voters,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
a bit of an anomaly with regard that piece
Hmm.
adds a different dimension to what went on in Michigan relative to some of the other parts of the
Right.
country, with
Mhm.
Trump winning Dearborn and Jill Stein getting a third of the vote there. Had this been sort of a traditional electoral
Mhm.
cycle, I don't think either one of those things would have happened, and that likely would have resulted in Michigan being in Harris's column.
But there
So,
still is the question about where's the black vote? I mean, as
yeah,
you know, Professor Fontroy, Detroit used to have regularly send two African Americans to the U.S. Congress. There are no African Americans from Detroit. There's been depopulation, also some
mhm,
movement to the suburbs. And so what had been a sort of enclave of black political activism, robust political, has this goes back to sort of the erosion of the black working class,
mhm,
right? And I think this has a great deal to do also, in addition to the things that you mentioned, to what resulted with Michigan.
yeah. Well, we're up on time. I just want to thank you for this. This has been great. I've enjoyed it.
Mhm.
Hope that those who are watching have gotten something from it too. Just want to mention quickly that the Race Politics and Policy Center is planning an event for January around the new president and what it might mean for minority communities around the country. And in February, we're going to do a retrospective. As some of you may know, uh, 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 this coming Thanksgiving Eve will mark the 40th anniversary of the launch of the Free South Africa movement, which helped to
Mm.
lead to the release of Nelson Mandela from prison rather, and bring down apartheid in South Africa. We're going to do a retrospective on that in February, and so I want you to stay tuned for details on that. We're really looking forward to getting that planned and up and running. So
Mhm.
for you, Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining us. On
Thank you.
behalf of everybody in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, I'm Michael Fontroy, Director of the Race Politics and Policy Center. Thank you all very much for joining us.